Hello. If you're a returning viewer, welcome back. I love your face. If you're new here, welcome, sit back, relax, and have a good time. My name is Nos, and this is not a Nintendo DS. This device is a GPD XD Plus, a retro handheld device running Android that released back in 2015, and it received a few revisions since. It has specs that, while I will not mention them, I will have them show up on the screen right now, and it's rocking a beautiful 5-inch IPS display with a 720p resolution. At the top, you'll find a micro SD card slot, a micro USB port for charging and file transferring, an HDMI out port, and finally, a headphone jack. I have been using this device for a while now, and I recently upgraded my device from Clean ROM to Lineage OS 18 and found that performance has been improved by a lot, just by changing my custom firmware. More details about that later when I show off a few systems running on the handheld. Back at the front of the device, you'll find two speakers at the bottom that sound pretty good, but not necessarily the best, a bunch of buttons for your usual Android actions like back and home and power off, two joysticks, a D-pad, face buttons, and finally an L3 and R3 buttons since the analog sticks do not click. The joysticks are pretty good, and unless I am mistaken, I believe these are PS Vita joysticks. They work, but I sometimes wish they had a little more travel time. The D-pad works okay for the most part, but it's really mushy and doesn't feel great, but somehow it feels like it's getting better the more I use it, so it might just be breaking it in or something. The face buttons are great now that I've used the device for a while, but it's worth mentioning that when I received the unit at first, they would stick down and feel really stiff, but that is no longer an issue, so my only complaint now is that they are kind of clicky and they make a lot of noise because of that. We do have a full set of shoulder buttons, and to be fair, I really don't have much to say about them other than they sound like a computer mouse. They're not the greatest, but they work. They work just fine. Before we get into the firmware and what the device can do, I want to mention again that I am using a custom firmware. When you receive this device, it will come pre-installed with its own OS, and I highly recommend changing it to either Clean ROM for Android 7 or Lineage OS for newer versions of Android. Just make sure to look it up before you decide to do this change, and to be fair, I would go as far as saying installing a custom firmware is almost a requirement to get the most out of this device, because it really increases performance. When we boot up the device, we land on this screen. Your device will not look like this. I am using ATV Launcher to change the way my apps are displayed. As you can see, we have full touchscreen support, which makes this device great for stuff like DS games. And even with a 720p resolution at this size, the screen still looks beautiful. Now let's jump into my front end and talk about game performances. For this video, I set up Reset Collection as my front end, and I am currently testing it out. Now, unsurprisingly, this device can handle anything from the 8 and 16-bit era without any issues. I have tested quite a few games on NES, SNES, and Sega Genesis, and I was really not surprised to find out these games ran just fine. Again, if we move over to the Game Boy line, you'll find that it also handles Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance beautifully, but honestly, I don't think that surprises anybody. Also, since I mentioned DS earlier because of the touchscreen, what I have tested so far ran without any issues at full speed, making this device really tempting when it comes to DS emulation. Where this device started surprising me, especially after upgrading from Clean ROM to Lineage OS, is the performance for 3D games. If I start up Phantasy Star Online Portable 2 on the PSP, we find out that the XD Plus runs it at full speed in 2x resolution. And I used to experience severe frame drops on this game when I was still running Clean ROM even at 1x resolution. Now I haven't tested many PSP games, but what I have tested ran perfectly fine at full speed with the exception of God of War, which is a usual offender since it is harder to emulate. Dreamcast ran surprisingly well for the handful of games I tried it on. It really performed much better than I expected. And with that in mind, I decided to test GameCube emulation again to varying degrees of success. Games like Phantasy Star Online run at almost full speed without tweaking any settings, while other games like Skies of Arcadia immediately tank. So if you're looking at this device for GameCube, you'll have to look somewhere else. PS1 also runs really well for the most part, depending on your settings. I was even able to run some games at 2x resolution, but it's worth mentioning that games like Tekken 3 will see some frame dips while running at 2x resolution. The final two devices I have tested are the Sega Saturn, which I almost skipped since it was reported to me that it has very poor performance on the XD, but when I sat down to record footage to show it off on this video, I found that it ran surprisingly well, and now I could have just been lucky with the handful of games I've picked, but it is worth mentioning that it works pretty well. Nintendo 64, however, was a real mixed bag. Performance is all over the place. Games like Mario 64 run beautifully, but Conquer Bad Fur Day is mostly playable, but it dips a lot, and games like Mystical Ninja just won't run at all. Like, if you look at my screen right now, you can see it runs at like 2 FPS. I don't even know. It's just unplayable. So I really wouldn't recommend this device if you're looking for N64 emulation. Okay, now I have shown off quite a few systems, and I'm sure some of you noticed the elephant in the room, the screen. While it is great to have this big 16:9 screen, and it works great for stuff like the PSP, a lot of these systems run in 4:3 resolution, and because of that, you end up with these giant black bars that kind of affect the look and feel of this device negatively. But remember, this device runs on Android, so we can quickly change this weakness into our strength. Like, that screen can become something great. You have access to so many games through the Play Store, and granted that the XD Plus has the specs to run these games, you can now play them super comfortably with the built-in controls. This also comes with the benefit of sideloading homebrew apps. For example, I'm running an Android port of AM2R here, which plays great on the XD Plus. Finally, I also want to highlight the potential of this device with game streaming through something like Steam Link or Moonlight. With this, you can play all of your PC games on the XD Plus and more. Like, who cares if the XD Plus can't handle GameCube games? Just stream them through your PC. Okay, to be fair, it is a bit of a pain to configure at first, but once your PC is set up with a good front end and your controls are configured in all the emulators you want to use, it opens many doors for you, and I think it's really worth it. So to wrap this up, would I recommend the GPD XD Plus to you? I mean, sure, if you can find one for cheap, I'd say jump on it. It's a great device. However, while working on this video, I found out that the device is reaching end of life and is getting harder and harder to find. It is also an aging device, and because of this, unless you get a good deal on it, I just cannot recommend it at its usual asking price. That is well into the $200 or $300 range. Overall, this device is really well built, and it is mostly comfortable unless you have to use the D-pad a whole lot, which can get a little uncomfortable. And when I say long sessions, I mean it, since you'll easily get 5 to 7 hours of playtime on this thing on a single charge. I'd also like to mention that it might not be the best device in the retro handheld market if you're a newcomer. It requires a lot of tinkering, and stuff like flashing the firmware for a better one is a requirement to reach the real potential of this device. And it just makes it hard to recommend to someone who's not comfortable with tinkering or customizing a device to their liking. And like, I'm not kidding, it's a must. You have to change to a custom firmware. It's you don't want to run this weird OS it ships with that runs on Android 7 and is half in Chinese. But anyways, I give this device a Diddy Kong Racing out of 10. And on that note, this is Not Syndrome signing out, and I will see you next time. I love your face.